Welcome everyone. You're listening to the ICA India podcast. Through the podcast series, we hope to bring out multidisciplinary dialogues by discussing the intersections of economics, policy, and cancer.
Welcome everyone. I'm Professor Smita Srinivas. I'm the India lead of the Innovations for Cancer Care in Africa project. And we have the great pleasure today of interacting with Dr. Vishal Rao. As many of you know, he is both an innovator as well as a practicing clinician and has many awards and quite notable recognitions to his name. Today, we're going to sort of launch into one of the first episodes of the India ICA Project podcasts as a way in which to get a broader conversation around cancer care going. And we hope in this to have a fairly freewheeling conversation and get some insights from Dr. Rao. So Dr. Rao, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Smita.
So we have a chance today to maybe start from where a lot of discussions with the media and colleagues have ended, which is we of course know that you have been an innovator looking at very interesting work in voice prosthetics, dealing with cancer patients who might have lost certain kinds of speech functions. And I wondered if you could begin there by telling us what was, in a global sense and in the Indian context, truly different, and then I'll get into some of the other questions.
So I think to start with, when I started this journey of innovation, I didn't really realize that I would actually end up innovating something. I thought I was dabbling on some of the broad problem areas, but this is something that has been there stuck with me for I think more than 2 decades now, that I've been obsessed with voice, even during my schooling, medical schooling, and even post the schooling in my specialization. Now that caught on in oncology, and I still continue to work in that same area. And one of the things that has often disturbed me is the aspect of throat cancers and patients in terms of inequality in health. And whenever you used to see these patients, this group of patients were a unique one because they don't have the large number of patients. So there were very few devices that were innovated for this. There were only 2 companies that were actually manufacturing devices, the American group and the European group. And both of them were out of reach of a common man. Today, among the 200 odd countries of the world, hardly maybe about 30-40 countries have access to them. The rest of the 140 countries are still not having access to them. So the fundamental thing that I thought was of how do we make something accessible, affordable, and affable. And the whole thing started with that effort on how do I make that coolie, the laborer, the worker, the daily wager who has lost his voice box to tobacco and throat cancer regain his voice at a very simple way. And that is what gave the foundation to the journey of innovations that I then ran. So through this entire journey, they were patients. And I often share this in my stories on innovations that, the most important thing as a bedrock of our innovation philosophy should be to identify a problem connected with a patient. Oftentimes today in innovations, you see people running for markets. I often say that your individual problem of a patient has a soul to it, and that's what defines the problem better. So I encourage innovators to say, hold on to one problem and hold on to it for your lifetime if you want, because it's not easy to get solutions. Now, when you hold on to it for a reasonably strong period of time, you see the bondage between you and the problem increases and deepens, and there are conversations. Now, it was in such kind of an instance that you bump across with some potential ideas. And that's what we did, that we were working on this entire thing. And idea was to look at the larger philosophy that speech and communication are a right to the society and not just a privilege which only a few people with finances will have. And I had, fortunately, my partner Shashank, who actually is a silicon expert, and he guided me through the process of the designs, and I guided him through the process of the science. So together, we actually innovated this device. And today we have thousands of patients speaking with it, some who hadn't spoken for 10 years, 14 years, who are again speaking with this device.
It's absolutely remarkable. And one of the things I wanted to ask you was that there is this tension, right? You pointed out quite correctly that a lot of innovation sort of is seeking a market. And that's quite different from problem solving, irrespective of what that potential market size could look like. So I wondered if you could elaborate that, because you have chosen a problem that could be argued to be quite niche. And at one level, your commitment to it has led you to a solution. On the other hand, the reason in the first place that there weren't a lot of people putting their heads to it was because of some anticipated size. So where does this come from? Is this a fundamental ethical problem solving kind of, we're just people who seek out certain kinds of problems? Where's both your work and your life philosophy in this? How do you frame this issue?
Broadly, I think if you look at the fundamentals of it, I've always believed that the end goal of education is knowledge, and the end goal of knowledge should be some form of service. So that kind of completes the circle. So when I look at passionately problems like what I chose, I always believe it's sometimes that it is in such kind of things that you really get to showcase the philosophies of conscious capitalism. So I've been one of those ardent believers and followers of conscious capitalism, where I believe on one end, like in this kind of a complex scenario, I am not praying and hoping that my product sells more, but I'm also working towards tobacco control and cancer control, where I hope someday that the product is not required at all. So this has two sides to it. And this, I think, are the future, I would say benchmarks of conscious capitalism, which the world post-COVID will open into, which will be adding value and not just wealth. This is going to be very, very crucial to build such pipelines. So the whole idea behind the philosophies here was on how do you create such models where you're able to take it to the moonshot and the ground shot, how you're able to balance quality with costing, and how you're able to push the philosophy of copyleft, where you sometimes innovate to make the world a better place and open up the innovations. Finally, I would like to say, I often say this, that, whenever you do charity, if it is without pain, then it is for Facebook, it's for Instagram and Facebook. But, charity should have pain, and then it becomes sacrifice. And that, I think, for me, has been morally entrenched and ethically entrenched with the practice of medicine to a larger extent.
So, but there is a question here which comes up certainly for some of the work I do, where you look at contexts in which if you are successful, you should be phasing out some of this. And this isn't often a benchmark that we tend to use in healthcare. So you have in the past talked about a focus on health instead of disease. And I wondered if you could elaborate on that a little bit, because so much of our both process and outcome measures in economics as well as in healthcare are driven really by quite different considerations.
And I think like you rightly pointed out, often healthcare today is assumed to be more about disease care. It's not about health. And that shifts the entire spectrum of discussion towards disease and not towards health, whereas health is absence of disease. And if you look at the spin out of that has happened to the society, I often say this in a lot of my meetings in tobacco control as a cancer surgeon. When I go and talk, I say a healthy society should have less hospitals, less doctors, and less illnesses. Here we are trying to build 1 in 3, 3 in 1 lane. That itself shows that the healthcare systems are weaker and the focus is shifting towards disease and towards GDP. I often recollect the words of one of my mentors, Justice M.N. Venkatachalaya, the former Chief Justice of India. He told me something very beautiful, that, you cannot limit your interpretation of progress and development on the limited milestones of GDP alone. Because you can run GDP of a country by smugglers and pirates better than politicians or governments. But the fundamental ethos of looking at freedom lies on expansion of freedom. And he told me when I showed him the voice device, he said, "You have made a little dent towards expansion of freedom of speech by giving what you did." And that contributes a little towards the aspect of bringing people back to productivity and just contributing a little to GDP. But he gave me a very beautiful example and said, if 3 doctors every day go walking from home to the hospital, the GDP is low. And if the same 3 doctors buy a nice BMW and drive to the hospital, the GDP is better. But if on the way, if the 3 doctors die in an accident, the GDP is the best. So GDP would be a very, very limited way to assess progress on sale. And today, healthcare is one of the things that could be contributing to GDP, which itself shows that we may be thinking in the wrong direction. We need to relook into the strategies of how we program health. And I think that is where the fundamental thinking will have to rearrange, and a shift will need to be created towards wellness rather than illness.
How is there a movement? Do you think that there really is enough traction on this amongst your colleagues? I think I know the answer on many of mine, but how does this play out in terms of oncologists?
See, fundamentally, I feel the thinking comes from how you are trained in your education. And your education is going to drive your future of practice. So somewhere I've always believed that if in education itself, if you can be molded towards a larger thinking and perspective on prevention, on a balance of healthcare, and not to look at treatment alone, then you see there is going to be a shift in this entire approach. The problem is that we've all been trained in terms of looking at only treatment and say that no, the public health is not health. And that creates this kind of an invisible divide of assumption, where sometimes I feel that as a cancer specialist, I'm sometimes being one of the most powerful advocates of public health. So there could be a needed synergy in these approaches, which is currently lacking. Because I think somewhere this has not been infused into the education system of curriculums that we follow in our training.
And as an oncologist, there have been arguments made that too many disease verticals, if you like, exist that kind of detract from both a public health mission, but perhaps also a kind of a community health approach where perhaps early diagnosis or better diagnosis might be a measure of how well you're doing, so that the number of people moving into treatment are both better tracked as well as better diagnosed. So could you talk to me a little bit about this? Because I think for the audience, there really is a constant debate. We see countries, even within our own project, and moving into areas that perhaps you could argue are following a similar model of both mistakes as well as lack of clarity in some areas that India or the US or others have done. Every country has this kind of hit or miss strategy. It isn't always very clearly thought through. So can you tell me a little bit more about this prevention and away from the specialization? I mean, they are not opposites.
So I think as an interesting perspective, I read some time back a very interesting paper from Hopkins, from John Hopkins University, which was published, which spoke about the leading causes of mortality in US and is US among the better healthcare systems. A very interesting paper, I think, by Barbara and a group, which got published, and thought-provoking, very interesting. They analyzed the 3 important leading causes of mortality in US in a bid to understand if it was among the better healthcare system. They found that the first one was cardiovascular diseases. They found that the second was cancer, and the third they felt was a doctor. And they felt that he was among the leading causes of mortality because of the high number of 250,000 annual deaths in United States because of the healthcare iatrogenic causes. So on a lighter note, they actually put this up as he is one of the causes and said that he's also climbing the ladder now. Now, in this approach of it, I mean, we know the importance we need to give to healthcare and how doctor is so important for the healthcare system today. And, while we talk about approaches like this, we need to factor in the truth that subspecialization or super specializations have come into the foray primarily to improve delivery of health services in a more focused manner. But yet you need to continue to have a bird's eye view. Today, when a patient walks to me with a specific region of a cancer in the mouth, I cannot miss a pedal edema and worry to think that could this be because of hyperproteinemia or is it a cardiac cause? There needs to be a holistic perspective in your approach, even when you do your super specializations or subspecializations. And that kind of a holistic approach is essential and mandatory today. The need to focus on such specialized approaches comes from the fact that we've got a wide access to technology and information that has made us know more and more about less and less. But having said that, that is essential today because of the way we've expanded healthcare system, our understanding of organs, our understanding of targets, proteins, bioinformatics. You're moving from bedside medicine towards gene side medicine, proteomics, metabolomics. So naturally, you will go into sub-specializations eventually. But at the same time, we need to look at a point when we converge. So we will have to have a horizontal level of expansion and yet a vertical connect that connects all of this information. Otherwise, we will have a larger disconnect where we will have people trying to look at finally treating the left kidney and the right kidney differently and having two specialists for each of these, which is not required. So I think this kind of a blended approach to science would need to evolve in the coming years. And we are obviously seeing this during the COVID period now of what we've learned of a blended approach like this, where nobody is an expert. COVID brought all of us together. There was no one single expert left today.
And to the joke you made, also kept a lot of people away from doctors who might have decided to go without in some cases.
They do a lot. I completely agree.
So one question for you is, if I understood correctly, the prosthetic, when your first model did require hands, the use of hands, and you imagined the second version to be hands-free. Could you talk us a little bit through that transition? And then I will hand off to Ojasvi, who has a couple of questions for you.
Sure. No, I think the fundamental thing here again in the thinking was, what does your patient want? It's not what I want or what did I imagine. It was what did the patient want? I saw a lot of these workers. So this whole thing came to me from a rickshaw driver who came back to me and said, look, I can't drive that rickshaw with holding one hand while talking to my customer, being socially interactive. So think about something for me. And I knew about the principles of how to create hands-free. And I thought this was the need for even a common man. I actually was of the assumption that this was something that was only required for those high-end elite, affordable class, which is what I was made to assume through my education and training, because we would never use these hands-free for poor people. But this was the man who made me think and say that why not me? I drive a rickshaw. I need to talk to my customer. I need to connect it with him. And during that time, I can't be using my finger and releasing my hand from the driving seat. So that, I think, was the transition of re-innovating your versions and re-looking at it. And I think through the entire journey, I have done that multiple times. Because every failure kind of reorients you into a thinking or understanding on how do you improvise and work towards absolute satisfaction of your customer or of your patient, to the extent that he trusts in you fully for solving his routine problems.
But you are trained in a way both to think about the problem, and you have also obviously dealt with surgical issues. So in a way, your step into engineering or kind of a certain kind of technical problem solving is facilitated by your intimate knowledge of anatomy and then the actual issues you need to deal with as a clinician. That is quite a specialized subgroup already. Can you imagine this translated into problem-solving teams easily? Should we be doing something different? For the audience, I think they would be interested to know.
I think design thinking in healthcare is absolutely a part of the training and curriculum. For me, it starts whether you're a surgeon or a physician. It starts with the basic fundamental tenets of thinking, of problem solving, and ways to approach that in unique ways. That I think is the fundamental foundation for design thinking in healthcare, which is much necessary because at the end of it, with all the accumulated knowledge, I keep telling my students, when you sit in front of the patient, you cannot push the textbook into the patient. You see, these patients are the reason the textbooks were written. So no matter what your knowledge is, unless you are able to translate it into patients, you will not be able to use these knowledges effectively to make an improvement. Now, just let's focus on only this aspect. The question is, how are you going to solve the patient? Now, I'm going to take you back in history to 1935, when the first paper of this was written by Dr. Joseph Beck, when he presented this data in the New York Society of Medicine. And this paper, I think, got published in the Laryngoscope Journal, where a patient, which he names in bracket as GR or some alphabetical connotation, does not even know which, we did not disclose the patient's name, was frustrated because he couldn't speak. He had lost his voice box and he took a heated ice pick and kind of stabbed himself in the throat. And out of frustration, and what happened later on was he did not die but continued to talk. So this man was the first innovator who actually showed us that, that you can speak. Now, how did he do it? Like I keep saying, if somebody has watched the Three Idiots movie where Amir Khan says, that keep telling yourself all is well. That is what you precisely did. When the man stabbed his throat, he made a puncture that connected his air pipe and food pipe. And suddenly the brain, which was all the time acclimatized to controlling the voice box, suddenly converted the food pipe into a voice box and made it to talk. Now, this is a simple observation of a doctor on how to solve a problem. Now, a lot of the times in this, if you take a little closer look, it is the patient who knows how to solve the problems rather than the doctor. Because there cannot be a person more desirable than the patient himself to solve his own problem. And the doctor can just be a partner in this journey. And that could, in partnership synergy, lead to some unimaginable innovations when both these intentions come together. So I think the point here is whether in whichever field it may be of medicine, while we can convert this entire simplistic thinking into a complex course, the simplicity of the thinking is going to be more crucial. I believe in the Occam's razor that when you're faced with an intricately complicated problem, try to keep the solution very simple, because the problem is enough complicated for you to further complicate the solution. So in the same approach of it, you could actually deal with some of these things. And that's why I believe that, whenever I want to work on a new technique, I go to a student who doesn't know anything about the subject. And I believe this is called the power of ignorance. 20th century knowledge was power. In 21st century, ignorance is going to be power.
And do you see, for example, if you have innovated in different spheres, but let me go back to this example because it's a good illustration. Now that this prosthetic exists, in principle, everybody around the world should have access to it. And there have been improvements in the design, for example, how often you might need to come back for a checkup or a replacement and so on. In your opinion, what are the 2 or 3 big policy roadblocks that prevent this from going to the scale of patients who do need them?
See, fundamentally, currently about 140 or more countries need it where poor people live. I initially, when I was interacting with the government of India on various occasions, understood a simple thing of what they could do. Now, one of the things that we at that time discussed and which the government of India has now very strongly implemented as a benchmark was to identify these throat cancer patients as a handicap. That itself shifts the trade motive of it to a larger aspect. So under the Rights of Persons with Disabilities Act of 2016, Government of India included them to recognize these people now as a special group, as a disabled group. And that shifted the entire focus from the business of it towards the actual recognition of this group, which was a neglected group globally, to understanding that this disabled group actually could actually reclaim their life.
Mhm.
So one of the things that I saw and which I've been currently working with the state governments here to reconnect with them is to help them reclaim and say that we don't even want to just give them their voices back. We want to also give them their lives back, their livelihoods back. And that is what this act is helping them do, to get a job, to come back to the society, to get productive again. Now, in a similar approach, now I've written to the United Nations on the disability area to tell that if they could still look at globally making this kind of an approach where globally countries adopt such a philosophy to make this into a voice handicap and recognize like the way government of India is doing, you will have a different approach and understanding, and you will have many more focus groups coming and joining hands in this to support such initiatives. And this would require a concerted effort. Otherwise, you will be only held with the business of it, and you will only have to look at the commercials of it rather than, and that is where we will have to bring governments into the picture to handhold us.
We've all been watching the Paralympics with sort of incredible interest. And certainly it is true that certain patient classes being brought into a disabled sort of category opens this up to a different kind of stakeholder sort of orientation and priority setting. So I think that's a very important thing. But you could argue that many different patients in many different categories would fit that bill. So how do you think about that problem?
Truly. So I've also played some roles on road safety, working with the government of India, with the Supreme Court committee, with the World Bank and various forums where I was just out of interest because I love roads. And I've been a part of the public health forum on road safeties. I often wonder that there are several such issues and each issue needs a champion. And that's why I think the point is sometimes we see these problems right in front of us, yet we tend to ignore them. I must give you one example of such a similar approach that, one of my senior colleagues and friends invited me to one of the programs he runs in the rural districts of Karnataka, where he takes mentally disabled people who are street wanderers. He identifies them, takes them to that small shelter home that he has created for them with a few 20 to 30 beds, and rehabilitates them, helps them remember who they are, and then sends them back to their respective hometowns. Now, until I saw that, I never thought that some problem like this existed. Now, every time I cross the street where I see a wanderer moving, I remember him. And I think that this is a neglected problem. And I think what you're saying is so right. The point is that we need to create more champions who understand the need for identifying this and also give solutions. The rest of it would be broader headings, but the broader fundamental need in these approaches is whether you recognize them by the government or by an act, the need to understand this group exists and identify some specific solutions for them would be a larger need of the hour. At one point of scale, the governments can always step in to give more strength into it. But there needs to be that approach to look at identifying such particular groups and giving them the necessary platforms and solutions. I hope that addresses.
I think it does. I think it's a difficult and controversial sort of approach, because of course the reason one could argue is that so many things remain the same is precisely because most people would like it to remain the same. They get some benefit out of it, and this is why everyone looks the other way. But you're right.
It's called vulture capitalism.
Yes, that's right. So, Ojasvi, do you want to chime in?
Yeah, thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Rao. This is very thought-provoking, all of it. We were talking about innovation, and I had a question that what are the implications of making the device you had made? And you had made it you had seen it through different perspectives, and what are the implications on health products, other health products, and what are some of the policy implications that come through this?
Great. I think this is very interesting. So the first thing I think what I looked at, I think I would like to reiterate on the conscious capitalistic approach. I think what I laid down as a larger philosophy was not just a product, but also bringing products, processes, persons, and policies together with the last P, which is philosophy. So I brought some things together, and I think that's opened the door for more opportunities to be created. Second, I think I've brought out the need for understanding that healthcare systems and non-health systems, rather than telling doctors and engineers, health and non-health systems will need to have a common ground where they'll come and connect to solve bigger issues. Thirdly, I think I've also broadly brought out the thought that we need to move from Make in India to version 2.0, which is Create in India. It's not just about importing from other places and assembling it here and saying we made it in India. I think these are the broad three aspects that I would like to bring together to say that these would be the things to look forward to, and that's the potential hope of impact I'm having on the future ways of businesses.
Yes, that is quite insightful. And the second question which I had is that given your experience, is the low and high tech classifications of innovation misleading when it comes to use for patient and support for firms?
So if I have to subclassify it, and I'm just trying to decode your question, when we say high tech and low tech innovations, a lot of the times it also means the high tech is for the privileged one and the low tech is for the needy one. Now, that is where I feel we need to dissolve some of these particular differences to look at broadly, and that is what increases the gap of health inequalities. And I think largely, like sometimes we talk in public health policies about the social determinants of health and the approaches of HIAP, the health in all policy approach. We will need to adopt a similar passion for technologies too, where we talk about high tech and low tech. Yes, there are some moonshots. Like I'm just giving you an example. There are some things that we want to talk about. We want to talk about solving cancer, and Cancer Breakthrough from USA has funded maybe a few $1 billion to solve cancer. It's kind of the most high tech innovation platform that you could get to look at it. But the solving of the problem seems to be more basic. So while we talk about a moonshot, we also have to have a ground shot. And I think both are necessary, but the fundamental tenets of both of these approaches should be to look at common problems that need priority solutions. Then you will come on a common ground where high or low tech won't matter. It is going to be about connecting the two. So while I invent on a drug that can solve cancer, I'm also trying to look at getting a drug to the poorest man in the village on the other side. And this kind of an approach between both of them would be required to go hand in hand.
If I could just build on that, if that is true, the organization of firms, you would almost every firm that is innovating in a sort of narrow product sense would inevitably be required to have a service arm component in terms of services, I mean, which is that if they haven't figured out how their product is relevant to a patient and they can figure out how to get it to a patient in a way that is both useful and humane, then in a way the product is not very innovative. Is, if I'm hearing at least a part of your response correctly.
True. And I think this is way far more of a complex question anyways to address. But I think you're right, Smita. The point here is that a lot of the times firms pressurize people to say that innovation is important. Correct? They kind of made it into a mantra to say that they're given a target on innovation. And I keep saying creativity and innovation would then be separated. So innovation cannot be put in as a monthly target or a yearly target and tell the creative man that, look, be creative in the next 24 hours. Creativity is like poetry or art, by itself, and problem solving needs freedom. And that's what time and again the biggest innovators of the world who have contributed significantly have shown on how time and again that freedom of thought processes gives the expansion of creativity.
But if I could just sort of bring us from the creative spark to the very mundane practical issues of, such, say, procurement policy, you could argue that your priority setting for policy, such as for things that are both pervasive problems and those that are especially experienced in a negative way by those who cannot afford options, would be at the higher end of both a procurement agenda, but that procurement agenda isn't simply an L1 tender, or it isn't simply some other process by which you acquire, but you also have a kind of a distribution, a delivery mode. And right now, that's not quite how healthcare works. So could you talk me through that? Imagine your prosthetic. If you had to imagine it from start to finish, isn't quite the right
Sure, got it. So I think this is something that I faced in practical points and experienced that when I invented the product, to after that, when I understood that there were new regulatory norms that came, which required that we further invest in Indian rupees about 5 crores into the entire machinery. I wondered on how am I going to survive this, because where are we going to get the money to set up a clean room, to set up a factory, to set up an entire machinery. And I still wanted to look at the social route, and that was complicated. Thereafter, I had Government of India come in. While the process would have been much easier if I had a private investor come in who would have put in X amount, but he would have said, I want X plus into 100 or into 200 amount within a span of 1 year or maybe tomorrow morning. We did not, we waited to allow the thing, and we asked governments, we expressed our interest, we wrote grants, and we allowed the entire momentum to build up in a way by which we were able to take it a little slow. But that slow would not mean that we dilute the value and the meaning of the purpose of what we are doing. So we went in with that approach. Government of India supported the thing through BIRAC. BIRAC stood with us. And then we won numerous number of awards that gave us more and more of small packets of energies in terms of building the machinery. To we giving the patent to the Government of India to hold with it and express the intent that our idea was to take the product to the masses. And that naturally is a tough process. And at one point in time, the government came in with a solution to say, look, beyond this, you will need to survive this product, and the government will need to survive this product also. So this has to have some meaning to it. So we created a very interesting model by which to the below poverty line patient, under the government scheme, it will be given free of cost. To the person who is able to afford it in a private sector hospital, it will be given at a nominal subsidized cost, which is still very affordable for that common man. And to the middle class man who can't afford neither the government BPL card, nor can he is fully in the aristocratic group. For him, we created a crowdfunding model or another balanced model where we would cross-subsidize and we would survive it, so that we are able to address all the three groups and yet continue with the philosophy of speech is our right and not just a privilege. So now, when you look at the entire process, we still have the manufacturing costs we still have the packaging costs, we still have the sterilization costs, the regulatory costs, thereafter that the distributor costs, the sub-distributor costs, and finally the hospital and the pharmacy costs, all factored in to yet balance meaningfully for every patient that he should be able to make it accessible. It's not going to be easy. It's not one single formula that fits everybody, but yet it's been a painful journey to try and work this out step by step, because at every step you realize a new understanding about the system. But I think that's how an innovator's journey is defined.
But you could argue, and this is just to sort of wind us towards the end here, you could argue that the government, so one solution is to have this kind of tiered pricing model, which is sensitive to what patients actually experience, and to push it through the demand process of a procurement model. But you could argue that the government could assist through a different means, which also lower both your cost and make it inexpensive in other ways for patients, which they could subsidize your clean room, or they could make it easier to do small batch manufacture, or they could help you with materials. What has your experience been on that? I mean, would you have preferred having more assistance on that front?
Smita, here, what they did for us was asked us which are the headings under which we wanted the support and give all of this. But if they were to individually go ahead and do each one of this for each individual in thousands of people, I'm sure none of them would get anything. Today, they've been able to do this much faster because they've been able to directly trust in us and tell us that we know you want this. This is the overall costing. Go ahead and do this. Because there are certain markets, the free markets, that you can't control until we become fully self-sufficient. For example, a silicon making machine has to be imported from China. Now you can't control that cost. But yes, what they did was they did subsidize the import duty on this, because we are importing it under this, and based on that you were able to get a rebate that helped you. So there are areas which they've already done significantly for me as of now. There's a lot more scope for us to do in the future. The approach would be to integrate some of these things and facilitate this in a much easier manner to encourage innovations. And like you said, like WHO has sometimes this approach of farm to plate. And the same approach needs to be looked at from an industry from the point of view of the manufacturing to the end consumer, where we will have to create such a process by which we are able to fast track, facilitate, and not kill innovations.
And I think your point there is quite important, because the farm to plate idea has certain, I think, quite important advances made on how to think about the wider ecosystem and its sustainability. That conversation perhaps hasn't happened to the same degree in healthcare. So there's an important opportunity. But Dr. Rao, any last questions for us? Any thoughts you want to share with the audience as we wind up, depending on hopefully some momentum that comes out of this?
No, I think most of it has been very beautifully covered. I believe I'm as good as the person who asked me the question, and you'll have asked me some fantastic questions. And I think it really was thought-provoking, because I've never actually interacted in such a deep manner with people drilling my head to understand my thinking. I was very happy with what questions you'll ask. I think these are pertinent questions for the future, and for us to structure in a formatted way. I really appreciate this thing. And I think what we've broadly summed up is, I was reading a very nice report from the Boston Consulting Group about the future of businesses post-pandemic with the heads, hands, and hearts. I think that is what the new age is going to be of conscious capitalism, which is going to be about wealth creation and value creation. It's going to be about looking at passion and compassion. And I think that's going to be the hallmark of the next generation. And I'm so glad that you all are putting all of your efforts to drifting the stream in the same direction.
Well, our efforts, and certainly the podcast is only as good as our last guest. So thank you very much, Dr. Rao.
Thank you.
It's really a pleasure to have you on, and we look forward to staying in touch.
Bye-bye.
Thank Thank you for listening to the ICA India podcast. Do follow our social media handles and stay tuned for the next episode.